Hi, and welcome to my presentation about Things Fall Apart, written by Chinua Achebe. First up, I would like to tell you about my agenda and what I would like to guide you through in this presentation. And what I will start with is the analysis, where I will make a characterization of first Mr. Brown, then a characterization of the relationship between Mr. Brown and the natives, and at the end, I will make a characterization of Okonkwo. Then I will move on to the interpretation, where I will interpret the point of view. Then I will move on to contextualize. Then I will contextualize this story to the role of the writer by Chinua Achebe and how to write about Africa by Binyavanga Wainaina. Here I will focus on why is the satirical elements of Binyavanga Wainaina's text not presented in Things Fall Apart, and does Achebe live up to what he himself said to be the role of the writer? But now let's move on to the characterization of Mr. Brown. In the text, the presence of Mr. Brown in the small village Umuofia is described, and here in line 5 to 6, it says that the white man had indeed brought a lunatic religion, but he had also built a trading store, and for the first time palm oil and kernel became things of great price, and much money floated into Umuofia. So he brings money and progress, and later in the story we will find that he also brings education to this small village. Next up is the respect that Mr. Brown has both for the indigenous, but also with the respect that the natives have for Mr. Brown. In line 21, 22 to 22 on page 1, the text says, he made friends with some of the great men of the clan, and one of his frequent visits to the neighbor villages he had been presented with a carved elephant tusk, which was a sign of dignity and rank. So in their own way the natives show Mr. Brown respect. But Mr. Brown also showed the natives respect, and this is shown in the patience he has towards the natives and how he's willing to learn about them and especially their religion. In line 23 to 24 on page 1, it says, whenever Mr. Brown went to that village, he spent long hours with Akuna in his obi talking through an interpreter about religion. So he's interested and willing to spend the time it takes to learn what the natives have to say about topics as, for example, religion. Next up is the characterization of the relationship between Mr. Brown and the natives, and the first thing you can say about this relationship is that Mr. Brown becomes very fond of the native. In line 19 on page 3, it says, but in the end he had to leave his flock sad and broken. And here it's important to notice the word choice. His flock indicates that there is a familiar relationship between the natives and Mr. Brown, and that he is emotionally connected to them. Another thing that characterizes the relationship between the indigenous and Mr. Brown is that when they discuss, it's possible to hear that through this discussion that they are similarly disposed. On page 1 in line 22, Mr. Brown say, you should not think of him as a person. And in line 25, Akuna answers, that is not so. So they can discuss subject as religion. Next up, I would like to make a characterization of Okonkwo, and I have chosen to separate this characterization or split it into two headlines. The first one I have chosen to call pre-skepticism, and this is what we get to know about Okonkwo before page 3 in line 15. This I'll get back to later. Before this line, we get to know about Okonkwo that he has very strong feelings about the new dispensation. It says, there were many men and women in Umuofia who did not feel as strongly as Okonkwo about the new dispensation. And this is said in the very first line. After what I call the skepticism, or where the skepticism first is shown, is this story is in page 3 in line 15. Here one line stands out like it is the view of Okonkwo, which I will get back to later in the point of view in the story. And this line indicates to the reader that Okonkwo has seen through the work of Mr. Brown. The line is on page 3, line 15, and it says, "From the very beginning, religion and education went hand in hand." And this is the voice of the storyteller, and it indicates that is only because another quotation says, "Mr. Brown's mission grew from strength to strength, and because of its link with the new administration, it earned a new social prestige." So these two quotations show us that the voice of a storyteller think that the only reason for Mr. Brown's successes is that he has linked up with the administration, and this can also show that there are more to what Mr. Brown has worked with in the city than only his goodwill. And then in general, Okonkwo is not impressed or certain or satisfied with Mr. Brown. This is shown in several lines, but for example in page 3 in line 24 to 26, where it says, "And he, Mr. Brown, had hoped that Okonkwo would be happy to hear of it, but Okonkwo had driven him away with the threat that if he came into his compound again, he would be carried off." Despite that, Mr. Brown is also the symbolism of how Okonkwo has lost his status. It says Okonkwo's return to his native land was not as memorable as he had wished. Next up, I would like to talk about a symbol there are in the text, and this is the symbol of the rainy season, because in the middle of the text it says that when Okonkwo is back and after Mr. Brown has left, or this is the first rain season since Okonkwo has left, that is the time where Mr. Brown leaves, and this could symbolize either one of two things. Either it symbolizes that the rain symbolizes that it is sad that he's leaving, like in many other movies or other stories. Rain is something when it rains when something sad happens, or it could symbolizes the wealth that the rain often brings to the very dry African soil. And in Africa, the rainy season is often awaited and highly appreciated, so perhaps that indicates that his depart is a good thing. Now I'll move on to what the point of view is, and I have chosen to say that the point of view and the storyteller is Okonkwo, and this I have chosen because of the introduction, where it says that Okonkwo is the main character. This fact doesn't have to. Based on this fact, Okonkwo doesn't have to be the point of view of the story, but I think because of several reasons that he is. The first one is that the first argument is that if the first rainy season means that it will be good to the people of the city that Mr. Brown leaves, it fits with what Okonkwo thinks, and also it fits with the fact that Okonkwo wants nothing from Mr. Brown. And the reason why Okonkwo is so skeptical about Mr. Brown is, from my perspective, because of two things. The first one is that he sees his city, which he has, where he used to be very powerful, he sees this city become into a British. He sees how his African city is managed in a British way, and how he doesn't think that this fits with the tradition of the city. Despite that, Okonkwo has been for exile for 7 years, so he has a very rough introduction to the changes. The last point is contextualizing point, where I would like to compare this text to other texts or other materials we worked with, and the first one is, why is the satirical elements of Wainaina's text not presented in Things Fall Apart? And the elements that are not presented is, for example, that the people of the story is not described as skinny. They have historical background, and this is something that the skinny people and the lack of historical backgrounds for African people. These elements belong to colonial literature about Africa, often written by Westerners. And when it is an African writer who has written this one, these elements become very wrong and almost ridiculous and very ethnocentric. Also, the next one is, does Achebe live up to what he himself said to be the role of the writer? And I have chosen to say that he does, because he creates the awareness about African culture, and he creates awareness about the political changes. He encouraged to discuss political changes in Africa, and then Achebe gives people like Okonkwo a voice.